Parlaqivsi uvlilotak uvanganeyak utqarvig miguranga. Today I wanted to show an amazing resource, a book. So if you don't have it, I would highly recommend you find it. It is called Puiguitkaat, and I learned from Leona Okakok that Puiguitkaat means something that you cannot forget, and it's something that is engraved in your mind, and that's what Puiguitkaat means. And this book, it came about during an IHLC, Iñupiaq History, Language and Culture, IHLC, elders conference, and I believe this is one of the first ones that they had. And during this conference, I believe it was part of the self-determination era where our people came together and they started documenting our stories, our history, traditional knowledge, and things of that sort. And so this book, Puiguitkaat, is comprised of elders that are my great grandmother's age and elders of that time. And they came together, they shared a bunch of amazing things, and I wanted to share something from this book, and it's in chapter 2, and it just kind of, our history just blows my mind. In chapter 2, they talk of a completely different time. It was when the world was it was really dark, and there was only 2 days. There was one dark day and then one bright day. And they talk about that when the earth began to have more people, the world turned over. If you think, here's our world, it just turned over. And when that turning over happened, it destroyed the animals that used to roam the earth, and nowadays only their bones are left. And I believe they're talking about the mammoths, because we find a bunch of mammoth bones and tusk all over the North Slope, even all over Alaska. But that is when they say the mammoths and other types of animals were destroyed. And in this time, they say before the world had turned upside down, it used to be hot. And it's kind of crazy because, here we live in the Arctic, it's cold, it's frozen. But based on our stories, they say it used to be hot. It was tropical, and there was trees and different types of foods, and it just, once it turned over, it completely changed. And once it turned over, it became cold, very cold. And in chapter 2, they talk of a great flood that had occurred. And if you look at the coast of Alaska, so here's Alaska, here we are in Iñupiaq at the top, and here's the North Slope, but here in Iñupiaq, we're right here. So in Puiguitkaat chapter 2, they talk about a great flood that had occurred, and the coast had receded all the way to a place called Mammoths, which is inland, maybe about here, give or take. But at Mammoths, from our oral stories, they say that was a place where people used to hunt the bowhead whale, and there are remnants of bowhead whale bones. And if you just look at a map, there's Iñupiaq at the top coast, here's the ocean, and then all the way inland where a place there could never be, you can never find whale bones nowadays, because how far Mammoths is from the coast. But based on the oral stories, they say there's remnants of bowhead whale bones there because of this great flood. There is also another resource called People of Kawerak, Legends of the Northern Eskimo by William A. Puiguitkaat. And in this resource, it also is in alignment with the Puiguitkaat book, when the elders came together and shared their oral stories and histories. And traditional knowledge. And he talks about the first people and how northern Alaska was also a warm place because it was close to the sun, and how there was no winter and it was always warm, and people lived in harmony, had no worries. They didn't really have to use their minds to survive, in the sense that like they didn't need houses or boats. They could easily go to a tree and get their food, and they didn't have to wear clothes. The animals are plentiful. He talks about how Inuit people were very large people. They were healthy, they lived long, and they were very happy. And he talks about a number of different disasters that had occurred and how life kind of just changed. And he talks about the first disaster, and once people, they were in harmony, and then now this first disaster had occurred. And so what happened was earthquakes, they came, they broke the ground. Different parts of the ground were sinking, new lakes were coming, and like other parts of the ground was coming up, so the land was just like shifting, and the people started gathering together, and then their way of living changed. They began to worry. They started having to use the resources around them, whereas before that they didn't have to use the resources. So they had to create things like tools and bags, pots, equipment, snares, and traps. And then one day the sun, it went behind the moon and it eclipsed. It started to get dark, but it wasn't like too dark to where you couldn't really see. The ground had began to frost, the animals began to roam, and the birds flew everywhere. They needed shelter, and they ended up finding places to stay because it started getting cold. When the sun and the moon, when it eclipsed, the animals, they were making loud noises because it was cold. Everybody was kind of freaking out, and the animals, they were making such a loud ruckus that the people couldn't hear each other. And the sun and the moon had eclipsed for 3 days and 3 nights, and it was on the 3rd day that the noise had quieted, meaning that a lot of the animals and the birds were dead. On the 4th day, the sun ended up coming out behind the moon, but it was still cold, and only a few people survived. All of the plants, the berries, the grass, the fruit were all frozen. The animals and the birds were dead, and only a few large animals walked around. The people were concerned, and they, like mentioned earlier, they started gathering together. They met with the leaders. They had to, identify leaders. Then they had to start thinking about how to make tools and how to use the resources around them in order to survive. And the second disaster was a flood, and all of the land was covered with water, and only 3 families had survived, according to William Puiguitkaat. During the second disaster, it was a flood, and it covered all of the land. And then once the water had dropped down and the land finally started to show, that signified that the second disaster was over. A new land appeared after the water drained away. It was full of rivers, lakes, and fish, all sorts of different plants, and also a lot of different animals like bears and caribou. It's so crazy because, these are oral stories and they have been passed down from generation to generation, yet our people from different regions know it. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was also in Puiguitkaat, and there's an elder, her name is Iñupiaq, and she was talking about, it was a discussion about where Inupiaq people came from and how they came to inhabit the land that we live in now. And Iñupiaq, she said that there was always people here, and a lot of you could see, like from evidence, is our old sod house homes and all the remains that are in there. And she talked of a time where there used to be giants. They were Inupiaq giants, and they also had their own sod houses. And there was a place, and honestly I'm not sure where it is, but she had identified a place called Imagaruk, Imaag with the dot RUK, Imagaruk. And she said this was a place in which the giants had lived, Imagaruk. And when that big flood had happened, so that second disaster, all of the giants ended up drowning, and they were the first peoples of this land. The giants roamed first, according to Annie Uluruk. And she says that the elders, they would tell stories about these giants. And, you know, she also talked about how elders from any other regions, they too have stories about giants. In Puiguitkaat, it was noted that one of the oldest elders of their group at that time, they talked about how there used to be giants living here, like on this land. And they mentioned that at Kawerak, which is not too far from Iñupiaq, like here we are at the Iñupiaq, at the way tip is Nuvuk, and then kind of like between Nuvuk and Iñupiaq is Kawerak. So Nuvuk and Kawerak used to be places where settlements were, where people used to live, but specifically at Kawerak, which is older than Nuvuk, Kawerak, there used to be a very big person named Kapausin, and Kapausin was a giant. And they have this story about this person named Kapausin. He used to torment 2 young orphan boys when they lived at Kawerak. And when the 2 young boys, when they got older, they got so tired of Kapausin tormenting them and bullying them. And so they ended up making a bow and arrow, and they ended up killing Kapausin. And the oldest person that told this story, I'm not sure the name, but they said that there is a grave, Kapausin's grave, that is still there at Kawerak, of this giant person. And another person, Eunice Levitt, she said that when she was young, she grew up at Nuvuk. So I mentioned that, so Kawerak is the oldest settlement here, and then people ended up moving to Nuvuk, and then from Nuvuk, the people came to Iñupiaq, where we reside now. So Eunice, she grew up at Nuvuk, and she grew up knowing the story of Kapausin. That was just like a normal, like everybody knew that story. And as a little girl, she would play around his grave. And in Puiguitkaat, she just talks about, you know, her early memories of that time. And she said she also saw a really big sod house at Nuvuk where she lived when she was young. And she didn't really talk much about that big sod house, but since they were talking about giants, I think she was referencing that big sod house she saw growing up was probably a giant's grave, maybe. I mean, sod house. But I'm not too sure. So just you know, all of these things just make you think and make you wonder, and just how amazing our history is. Even if you know, look up on the internet, you can, you know, look up a lot of different things nowadays, but referring to like a time frame, and that's one of the biggest questions I always hear is kind of like, well, when did this happen? So our history, our oral stories, they say after the world turned over, that is when animals such as like the mammoths were destroyed. And if you just look up on the internet when mammoths were kind of extinct, it was 10,000 years ago when mammoths were extinct, and that had occurred with this type of climate change that happened. And it just like baffles my mind that it's just kind of like in aligned with our oral stories. They also say that there was another population of mammoths that kind of stuck around and survived till about 4,000 years ago. Here is part of a mastodon or mammoth ivory that I found this summer. I did find another one that was whole. This one is in half, but it was maybe about this big, but it was whole, like the cone shape. You can tell that it is mammoth or mastodon based on the way it peels. So you can kind of see like the layers here. Walrus ivory is a little bit different, but this is how you can tell that it's mammoth or mastodon. Here's another piece. You can kind of tell like the texture of it. They have like a certain, I don't know how to describe it, like lines on them somehow. Let's see. Here's not that one. Here's another piece. But anyway, I just wanted to share that part that, you know, we have these oral stories. They've been passed down for thousands of years. And another crazy thing is that my uncle Mike had actually, you know, when I was talking with him one day, he brought this up. He said that, you know, our language and our culture, our people have been around for such a long time that you see it in our names, our traditional Iñupiaq names. And the people of Puiguitkaat in Point Hope, one of their names that have been passed down is Kawerak. Kawerak translates to mammoth. And, you know, that just should, you know, also make you think how long our people have been around, that they knew what mammoths were. They have a name for mammoth, Kawerak, and that name has been passed down and is still used to this day. All of the stories that I'm sharing with you guys, it's stories that I've read in these books and these resources, told by elders. So it's not like from, you know, just coming from me. These are elders that have shared these stories, and from that I am sharing with all of you, and I hope you all enjoy as much as I do. I just love history and I love learning all of this stuff, so it excites me, and yeah, hope you enjoy.